Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I'm going to be doing the Future Classics book tag, which was created by the wonderful Eric Carl Anderson, and he was kind enough to tag me. And I'm really excited to do this tag because I think it's so interesting to think about what makes a book a classic. And I apologize in advance if I go on some tangents, but I just think it's a really interesting thing to consider, and the questions that Eric has are so interesting, so I'm excited to get into it. The first question is, pick an established classic that you think will still be relevant in the future. So this is an interesting question because I think it's kind of hard to sort of uncanonize a classic. By the time a book becomes a classic and is considered a classic, it usually means that it's kind of cemented its place in cultural memory. So it's kind of hard to say which books that are considered classics now won't always be considered classics, but I think one book that will really stay relevant for years and decades to come is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And obviously the past year or so has been a massive year for The Handmaid's Tale, partly because of the hugely successful TV show and also just because of the current political climate and that book becoming kind of more relevant than ever. And so while I think The Handmaid's Tale was already really highly regarded and kind of a modern classic, I think this past year has just been recognition and cultural permeation on a whole nother level for that book. It's not only incredibly timely, but it also is very timeless. You know, that book was written over 30 years ago, but it feels like it could have been written yesterday. At this point, as a dystopian classic, I think The Handmaid's Tale is as relevant as something like 1984, and I hope that going forward it proves to be just as enduring and as widely read as a book like that. Question 2 is, pick a recent book which you feel has gone under the radar, but which you're confident will become a future classic. And this question is really difficult because if a book has gone under the radar, that kind of doesn't bode well for it becoming a future classic. There are certainly a lot of examples of classics that only became classics years or decades after they were published. The Great Gatsby is an excellent example of that. It wasn't super widely read or considered to be the great American novel until about 30 or 40 years after it was published. And that's because there are so many different factors that go into whether a book becomes a classic or continues to be read. The idea that classics are the best books that have stood the test of time because they're of the highest quality kind of ignores the fact that there are a lot of other factors at play, whether it be kind of the whims of publishing or the market, or whether a book gets placed on high school and college syllabi in a consistent way. All that's to say that it's really difficult to predict which books will continue to be widely read in the future and which sort of forgotten books might have a resurgence in the future. But I'm going to go with A Manual for Cleaning Women by Lucia Berlin, because this book in and of itself is a sort of second coming for this author, in that it was published in 2015, more than a decade after Lucia Berlin died, and although she was writing throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it wasn't until the publication of this book that she really started to get critical and widespread recognition for her work. I haven't actually read this book yet, but I've heard great things about it, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not in the years to come Lucia Berlin becomes one of those authors that is considered a must-read for short story writing. Question 3 is, pick a title that won one of your favorite book prizes recently that you think will still be lauded in 50 years' time. So I have not historically followed book prizes super closely, so I don't have a favorite book prize, but I'm just going to go with a couple of books that have been critically praised and whose authors have won awards for their writing. The first book that I think will still be highly praised and recognized in 50 years' time is We Were 8 Years in Power by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And in some ways, I might be going out on a limb by saying this, but I think that We Were 8 Years in Power might be more enduring and more interesting to future readers than Between the World and Me, which is his critically acclaimed memoir. And I say that because I think We Were 8 Years in Power is a real definitive text about the Obama years in American history. And I think that's a period of history that going forward is going to be deeply explored and mined over and over again by historians and sociologists and academics, just because it's such a singular and remarkable period in history. And I think We Were 8 Years in Power is a really interesting time capsule that captures what living through that period felt like. I think it's denser and maybe not quite as cohesive a read as Between the World and Me, but I do think it's more ambitious and broader in scope, and for that reason I think it might end up being more valuable for future readers. I don't know, I might be completely off base by saying that, because I do think Between the World and Me is going to be a classic in 50 years time as well, but I guess I just hope that people read We Were 8 Years in Power as much as they read Between the World and Me going forward. Another book that I think is already a classic, even though it was only written 8 years ago, is The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander. And this is really interesting because this is a much more academic text, which you think would hinder it from becoming a classic. It's definitely a landmark text about mass incarceration in America, and while I think it's a book that will be read and cited and referenced in academic circles for years to come, the fact that it has name recognition and seems to be fairly widely read outside of academic circles, I think is a pretty good indication of its impact and its potential staying power among a broad base of readers. Question 4 is pick a book that you haven't read yet but that you think will become a classic based on reputation alone. So this is a tricky one because not only have I not read this book, but I also don't really read YA, but I'm gonna go with The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. Obviously, this book has been everywhere and it seems to be resonating with readers for a number of reasons, and I think that this book might become a classic in the way that Catcher in the Rye is now a classic. Obviously, these books are dealing with different subject matter, but I think they're similar in the sense that they are written about young people for young people. Even though adults love Catcher in the Rye, it's very much a book that is proto-YA fiction, if you think about it. Catcher in the Rye is interesting because it is both an artifact of the time period it was written in, but it also taps into something universal and enduring about being a young person. And I think, from what I understand about The Hate U Give, is that it's so powerful because it is very much of this cultural and political moment, but I assume that there's stuff in there too that's just about being a young person and being a teenager that also is very universal. Question 5 is pick a favorite book that you would want your grandchildren or your friends' grandchildren to read in 50 years' time. For this, I'm gonna go with the Neapolitan novels by Elena Ferrante. I think these books are really noteworthy because they're both compulsively readable, which kind of accounts for them becoming these massive popular bestsellers, but I also think that the story in the books and the themes that they tackle make them worthy of academic and critical consideration as well. And I think, for better or for worse, books often become classics when they appeal to a lot of readers and are widely read, and when they're placed on syllabi in an academic setting. And that's all to say that the Neapolitan novels are both books that I just want to shove into the hands of everybody I know, and they're also books that I really wish I had had a chance to study in a college or high school setting, because I think that they're so rich and layered that they would really stand up to academic and critical dissection. I hope that they are classics in the making because I think they're fantastic books that I hope people will read for years and years to come. So those are all my answers to the Future Classics book tag questions. In the comments below, I would love to know your thoughts on an additional question that deals with this topic, and that is, are there any recent books that have been highly praised or extremely popular that you think won't stand the test of time? I would love to tag Amy at Amy Poole, Leah at Hide and Seek, Diana at Diana in Color, and Sabrina at Unmanaged Mischief. I love all of these channels and I would love to hear their thoughts on this topic as well. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll see you next time. Bye.